Hi, Candi.
Hi, Anna. It's so great to see you today.
Likewise. I'm so happy to have you here. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Wonderful to have the opportunity to reach out to people in the field to tell them about how great it is to be in the ORMS field.
Oh, that's great. So today my guest is Candi Yano. She's a distinguished professor with a joint appointment between the Department of Industrial Engineering and Operations Research and the Operations and Information Technology Management Group at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Candi's primary research interests are production, inventory, and logistics management, particularly on how to deal with various sources of uncertainty in these contexts, as well as interdisciplinary problems involving operations and marketing. She has authored or co-authored over 80 articles and book chapters on these subjects and is the recipient of a variety of NSF and industry grants. She has served as the editor-in-chief of IIE Transactions and department editor for Management Science, as well as in various editorial capacities for operations research, interfaces, now Informs Journal on Applied Analytics, manufacturing and service operations management, service science, and naval research logistics, among others. Candi is a co-founder of the Women in Operations Research and Management Science Forum, known as WORMS, and was awarded by Informs for the advancement of women in 2008. She has also received the Kimball Medal by Informs, the highest award for service given by the Institute in 2018, and the Informs President's Award in 2022. Candi is a fellow of both Informs and the Institute of Industrial and Systems Engineers. Candi, such an honor to have you here. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation.
Oh, thanks so much for the opportunity. Really great to have this conversation with you.
Okay, so let's start. Candi, you were born in 1956 in the US, but where exactly?
I was born in a city called Gardena in Southern California. It's just south of Los Angeles. And at the time I was born, had a population of about 50,000, and now it's about 60,000. So it's just a small town, mostly bedroom community, not much in the way of business or industry or anything like that.
Uh-huh. Many Japanese Americans settled in Gardena, right?
Yeah, so way back when it used to be very agricultural. Of course, there were people living there, but there were lots of, as I understand it, strawberry farms. And so people came out, it was a good environment to grow those kinds of crops. And so I think that people settled there because they could do that. The strawberries were, at that point, a very lucrative crop.
Uh-huh. And when and why did your ancestors come to the US?
So, to be honest, I don't know exactly the year when my grandparents came, but both sets of grandparents came around 1920. And so my guess is that both of my grandfathers came first, and maybe at that time, there were arranged marriages, and they probably sent for their wives-to-be to come over. There was a law instituted in 1924 that essentially prohibited Japanese from, and maybe other Asians from coming into the United States at all. And so there was a huge influx in 1923, right before that. And I think that my grandmothers were among those people.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And what did your grandparents do when they arrived in the US?
So my dad's parents had grown up in a farming community, and so they came over to farm, I think, strawberries, right? But my mom's father was an editor of a newspaper, one of the editors of a newspaper. And so he came over, I think, to become an editor of a Japanese language newspaper based in Los Angeles at that time. And so that I just discovered today that newspaper started publishing in 1903, and it's still publishing. So it's doing quite well. Now it's a bilingual newspaper, it's Japanese and English, yes.
Uh-huh. And tell me about your parents.
Okay, so my parents were both Depression era babies. And so, they were not able to go to college because their parents just didn't have the means to send all of the children to college. So my dad, both of my parents were born in the United States, and they have high school graduation, high school diplomas. My dad worked in water sanitation for the city of Los Angeles for quite a number of years. My mother started working part-time when I was maybe around 12 years old, and then went full-time a little bit later. And she started in secretarial, basic accounting kinds of positions. But by the time she retired, she was an office manager. And so, she kind of managed to move up in terms of responsibility. But, I think that they took very good care of us, despite the fact that they were not able to get an advanced education. They were very supportive of my sister and me getting a good education.
Uh-huh. So you have one sister?
I have one sister, yeah. She's about 3 years younger than I am. She lives in Southern California, Orange County. Yes.
Uh-huh. Did she become a scholar like you?
No, she eventually got a certificate that allows her to do tax returns. Again, she has worked as a bookkeeper and the like. I think that it's kind of interesting, and I see this in some of my students. I think that she was kind of pushed into doing things that she was not necessarily good at. And then it just became too much of a challenge for her. So she kind of backed away and kind of found her own way to do something that, she was good at and could be successful at. Yes.
Okay. How was your family affected by the Second World War?
Oh, now this is sort of a long story. As you may know, Japanese and Japanese Americans were sent to relocation camps after the start of World War II. And so my dad's family was sent to Gila River in Arizona, relocation camp there, and they were there essentially throughout the period of detention. My mother's father decided that he did not want to stay locked up. And so I think they were in a relocation camp for a while, and then decided that they would go to Japan. Now, this was a challenge for my mom, because she was born in the United States. In fact, so she's one of 4 siblings. The eldest daughter was born in Japan, but the other 3 had been born in the United States, and their whole childhood was in the United States. And so going to what was then a foreign country for them was definitely a challenge. My grandfather they were living in the Hiroshima area. My grandfather was working for the big local newspaper in Hiroshima. And he unfortunately was killed by the bomb there. My grandmother eventually, she stayed there for a while. The whole family came back to the United States gradually. But, because my grandfather died then in 1945, I never had the chance to know him.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear. But I read somewhere in an interview that you gave for the folks there at UC Berkeley that your family never held any grudge.
Well, so I didn't communicate so much with my mom's mother because she didn't really speak English very well, and I didn't really speak Japanese very well. So I didn't really get a chance to understand her feelings about the situation. But my mother was quite young when all of that happened. And so, she is actually happy to have lived most of her life in the United States. She feels that, she's an American. And so I think that it's good that she never really passed on to me any bitterness about the whole situation with the bomb and so forth. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you speak Japanese?
Well, my parents, actually my grandparents, sent me to Japanese school for a while. And in the mode I was taking it, I had to spend 6 hours a day on Saturday, every Saturday, for about 10 months a year, trying to learn Japanese. And yes, I did learn a little, but so my mom, having lived in Japan for a while, bilingual, but my father doesn't really speak any Japanese. And so I really didn't have anybody to speak with. So I have been in Japan a few times. After a few days there, I can sort of follow what people are saying, most of it. But to be honest, it's very difficult for me to, carry on a conversation or anything like that. Yeah, because I don't have much occasion to use it. Yeah.
It's like me with Tamil. It's quite complicated for me to. I may speak one or two words, then 10 words of English. That's complicated. I understand. Do you have any memories of the social movements from the 60s in California?
Well, okay, so there were riots that occurred in the southern part of Los Angeles, the Watts district, around 1965. And really, there was a lot of violence due to the fact it started off with, so I was pretty young at the time, so I only just read about this really, due to an African-American man getting arrested by a white officer. And there had been a lot of built up tension due to discrimination against African-American people. And so there were around 6 days of riots. At the end, Martin Luther King actually came in to try to help heal the situation. But I do remember that. But, so it's about 10 miles away from where my family was living. And so, we saw it a lot on television, I would say, just because, there was a lot of coverage in the local news. But I didn't witness anything myself because I was just a kid at the time. I was not really affected at all by, what was going on in the Vietnam War era. I don't, living in a kind of a small, quiet town, we didn't see any protests there. So, I only saw it on television like everybody else.
Mm-hmm. So you're not influenced by the hippie movement and all of that?
Well, being in Berkeley, it's hard not to be influenced in some way by the hippie movement because I honestly think that some of the people from that era are still here selling trinkets on the street. So you may not be aware, there's a street called Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. And so this place in good weather is lined with many people selling all sorts of crafts and so forth. And so my husband was actually, he lived in Berkeley as a kid. And so we sometimes joke that, the same people are now, long gray hair or something, they're still selling the same kind of stuff that they sold back then. So, I sort of see it here in Berkeley, the remnants of that, but, not when I was a kid. I didn't see it when I was a kid. Yeah.
I see. What type of music did you like to listen in those days?
Well, I listened to what I think people call soft rock now, or maybe so like Carole King and Peter, Paul and Mary, and I really liked that sort of thing back then. And so I remember going away to college and my parents had the records. They were vinyl records back then, but I actually recorded onto cassette tapes. That's what we used back then. Some of these songs so that I could take them away to college with me. Yeah.
Right. It's a different era, right? You had to really
it's a different era. That's right.
Work to get your songs, and you tend to value the artist and even the albums more because you have to, go to the record store or try to record it from a different source, and then you care more, you value more, right? And
I still have some of those tapes.
Oh, nice.
I don't know whether they work though.
Yeah, nowadays, because of streaming, a lot of youngsters, they just take things for granted, and they can barely listen to more than 1 minute and just change to another song or. It's really a different time now.
Right. Definitely.
Did you play any musical instruments, or did you get involved in any musical activity?
Well, okay, so I took piano lessons from the age of 6 until I was in about the 10th grade. And so at the end, both the Japanese school and the music lessons were kind of interfering with sort of normal extracurricular high school activities. So I convinced my parents that, I'd done enough And especially with the Japanese lesson. So I had, on my father's side of the family, I'm the eldest of 14 grandchildren. And I'm the only one who lasted that long, around 8 years. Everybody else was allowed to quit after 2 or 3 years. Because Japanese is not a commonly used language around the world. And so, it's sort of interesting to learn, but in a practical sense, it's not that useful.
Mm-hmm. Did you study in a public or private school?
Okay, so all of the schools I went to were public. My elementary school had about 1,000 students. My junior high school, maybe 2,000. My high school, around 3,000 students. They were all very, very big schools.
Uh-huh. And you graduated top of a class with 1,000 students in high school, right?
Well, there were like 3 or 4 of us. So I was not alone. Okay, 3 or 4 of us at the top of the class. But, it was, and we didn't even know it until the very end, right? Nobody tells you along the way. But yeah, it was nice. But back then, in our high school, there was no valedictorian named or anything. So, we just found out from the school counselors afterwards.
Uh-huh. Did you attend advanced classes?
Well, I took an AP calculus class. There were some AP classes available, but, it was a big public high school and, the kind of not exactly very stringent resources, but, there were not a lot of opportunities for very advanced classes at that time. So we had just basically that AP calculus class available.
But were the professors flexible enough with your high performance? Let's put it like that.
Yeah, so I would say along the way, a lot of my teachers were very flexible with me. I mean, I had this problem when I was in like the 2nd and 3rd grade, because I could finish the assignments faster than some of the other students. I would start talking to my, whoever was sitting next to me. And then, the teachers would get mad and so forth. And so I realized this was bad behavior, but, I was bored. So some of my teachers were very good at recognizing they just needed to find other things to keep me busy. And so it was really some of my like the 1st and 2nd grade teachers who encouraged my parents, why don't you get her some music lessons and then she can spend time playing with the school orchestra. And then also, I think it was kind of an interesting experience at the time, although I didn't really digest it. I was sometimes asked to go help in a special needs class. So at my elementary school, which was quite big, they had 1 or 2 classes for special needs students. And so sometimes I would go over there and I'd basically be a tutor and a friend, right, just to connect with them. So I ended up doing, sort of these extra things within the context of what was going on. But I do appreciate the fact that the teachers kind of recognized that I needed some things to keep me busy, and they gave me these opportunities because I appreciate having learned music. I appreciate having understood that there were, people with educational disabilities, even though I was quite young at the time.
Mm-hmm. So they respect your level. You tend to excel in your activities in school, and they found a solution for keeping you busy when you finish the assignments before and so on, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I do appreciate my teachers for that, yes.
Uh-huh. Is it true that you were a victim of occasional social exclusion from certain activities?
Well, in high school, I feel like there were some other students who didn't like students who did well in class. And so, there were times when it became hard to join certain clubs and the like. I mean, I eventually did, but sometimes it required a little bit of patience. So it's kind of unfortunate. I think that sort of thing still goes on, right? And bullying and hazing and the like. And I would say that it's not really a victim. It didn't really hurt me badly because I kind of figured out how to overcome it. But it is a challenge. It can be a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can happen in many places. At least here, the word bullying it has been incorporated to our vocabulary. Before, people did not even know that. So they are taking more serious now these issues of students mocking their colleagues or trying to, make one feel really bad. So it's unavoidable at times, but I think here it has been improving, at least in private schools. In public schools, I think it's still a long way to go because it's a bit more complicated. Right?
Yeah, right.
It appears that your first experience writing a review report happened when you were still a high school student, correct?
Well, actually, I was in the 6th grade at the time, and my teacher, I think that it was his responsibility to provide a review of this textbook. So, the publisher, I think, sent him the textbook and he was supposed to write a review, but he asked me to read the whole book and write a summary of it. So that's what I did. I didn't realize, the context until I was much older, but I don't know, kind of, it was interesting, kind of gave me another big book to read along the way.
So that happened before high school, actually.
I was literally 11 years old at the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
It's hard to believe in retrospect, really.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I know you went to Stanford for college, but was that your first option?
Yeah, my first choice. I didn't have a lot of money to apply to school, and back then, applications relative to people's salary, application fees relative to people's salary were kind of high. So my parents said, you can apply to 3 places. So I applied to 3 places. Stanford was definitely my first choice.
And what were the 2 universities that you tried?
Oh, so I also applied to USC, University of Southern California, and then UC Irvine. So back then, almost everybody from my high school who was intending to go to college would apply to USC. It was kind of a standard thing to do. A lot of people also were applying to UCLA, but I decided I wanted to go to a slightly smaller campus. And so that's why I chose UC Irvine, which was much, much smaller at the time. Now it's got 25,000 students or something like that. But, yeah.
You have a major in economics, but again, was that your first option in terms of college degree?
Oh, this is a very long story. So I've taken a lot of math and math-related classes in high school, but we talked about calculus later, but my high school teacher was not very good at motivating why we were learning calculus. And so I decided that I was going to try to do something else for a while. So I was mostly taking psychology classes, and I really liked the quantitative end of psychology, memory, cognition, stuff like that. But I was meanwhile also taking economics classes. So at one point I volunteered to be a research assistant for a Ph.D. student in psychology. But I didn't realize it. I should have asked for the fine print in the job description, but my job was babysitting the 5-year-old subjects for her experiments. So I decided that, well, maybe no, I don't really want to do this. And, maybe that's not a very good reason. But then I thought, well, I really like the econ. So I ended up finishing out in econ. I satisfied the requirements for both degrees, but at that point in time, Stanford would only give one undergraduate degree, so I took it in economics.
Right. So you have completed the credits for psychology,
yes,
but you did not get the major in that field officially.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Were you exposed to OR during your undergrad years?
Yeah. So it turns out that some economics courses are actually operations research in disguise. So economists think differently about things. And so I had one class during my senior year. It was actually nonlinear optimization with lots of other stuff. But then we learned linear programming as kind of a special case. Linear optimization is a special case of nonlinear optimization. And so, economists kind of see things the reverse of how most OR people get it. So I did get exposed to operations research, but I didn't really... It was not labeled that way, okay? So I didn't really kind of view it that way at the time.
Yeah. We were talking about the mid-70s. Did you have any coding classes?
Yeah, so I did take one computer programming class. It was in a language called Sail, which is an Algol-based language. So it was kind of more advanced than Fortran in a way. But that's all I ever took. And I mean, I ended up having to do programming later on, but a lot of it just ended up being self-taught. Yeah.
Okay. Your dad suffered a severe on-the-job injury and was no longer able to work as usual. Because of that, you had to start working part-time to pay for your studies and living expenses. How did you balance between your academic activities and work?
Yeah, so that happened during my sophomore year. And fortunately, I was able to find a part-time job on campus very quickly. And then, I mean, at some point, you sort of have to give up some social events and so forth. But I had a job initially typing draft manuscripts for a professor. So the professor would handwrite it and I would type it up. And they were just meant to be drafts, but I spent maybe 6 months doing that and went on to some other jobs later. I chose to work on campus for a while because it just made it much easier. You could squeeze in a few hours in between classes and the like. Finally, in my senior year, I got a job that paid much better off campus, and it was working at the subsidiary, the textbook subsidiary of IBM. I don't even know if it still exists. But in the beginning, also, this was in an era where there's no internet at the time. And so what the publishing companies would do would be to send out free copies of textbooks to professors so that they could take a look at them. And so my initial job was just being a key punch operator to put in information so that this stuff would get sent out. And then later on, again, I had a really good boss. And so he gave me some other more interesting projects. And I was asked at one point to try to analyze whether various salespeople were being thoughtful and how they sent these things out, or whether they were just, sending them out without thinking about whether it was an effective thing to do. And so I got to do, I'll call it very basic marketing analysis at the time. And then another project I was asked to work on was to write a solutions manual for a textbook. And that was very interesting because I sort of discovered along the way that some of the material in the textbook not correct. So they went back to kind of fix the textbook as well. So that was an interesting project.
Yeah, you had a very busy life. I didn't go to classes.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You graduated in 1977. When did you get married?
6 days after my undergraduate commencement.
Wow.
Yeah, it was quite a very busy week.
Yeah, and you have been married ever since.
Yes, right. That's right. Yeah.
Very, very nice. What made you decide to apply for a PhD position in OR?
So one of the jobs I had as a senior, about that time, so you have to think back to, what was going on at the time. Okay, so back then, photocopy machines were just, they didn't have any capability to put in any codes or anything. So the Stanford OR Department allowed the PhD students to make photocopies on the departmental photocopy machines. And so the students would come in, and when they would make copies, they would just record the number of copies. So my job at the end of every month was to tabulate this. And then on top of that, I would have to calculate the 5% sales tax that the students had to pay. And so I just did this for a while. I mean, it was, just to make money. But then Professor Pete Vienot, who was chair of the OR department at Stanford, knew that I was doing econ and I'd had a fair amount of math. And so he encouraged me to apply for a PhD in the department. So I did, and I was admitted and with a fellowship. So that was really a great opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Eventually, you moved from the IEOR graduate program to the industrial engineering graduate program. What was the reason?
So I was, I think, the token non-math major in my cohort. So it was quite common for Stanford to admit N students, and N-1 were essentially math majors and maybe one more. And that one more was me that year. And so, I had not really learned how to do mathematical proofs or anything like that prior. And so it was really tough going in the first semester. So I decided that, I really liked the subject matter, but I felt like I couldn't take it at the same pace. I needed a little bit of time to do some background and background work. And so after switching, what I did was I actually ended up taking a lot of OR, but I ended up taking it a little bit more slowly, kind of mixed among my industrial engineering classes. And that worked out very well for me. So I ended up getting the 2 masters, one in OR, one in industrial engineering along the way. Yeah.
Not bad. You also became teaching assistant in the second year, right?
Yes, that's right. That was a common thing to do. That was a very interesting experience because my first teaching assistant assignment was for a new assistant professor who's a really great guy, but his first semester teaching, and it was a very big class. So I learned how to handle office hours, lots and lots of office hours. And then, I learned a little bit more of the material, learned it more deeply. And so that was a good experience. So I was just a teaching assistant for, I think, 2 quarters. And then the department was very kind to give me the 3rd quarter off because I had worked so hard in that 1st quarter. And then after that, the department had some research funds available. And so I was on a research assistantship my 3rd and 4th year.
Yeah. Teaching is always an interesting experience because you can learn in the process. Yeah, it's not only about the teaching, and you are forced to become more knowledgeable about what you're transmitting and so on. So it's always something that can be helpful in one's background, I think.
Right. And then, realizing that students have different backgrounds and that you need to explain things perhaps in different ways depending upon the background that they have. And so,
absolutely. Yeah. Right. And that gives you experience and a certain type, let's say, of repertoire of ways of explaining the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. During that period, you voluntarily helped to start a peer advisor program in the industrial engineering department, right?
Yes. So I noticed that professors were spending a lot of time helping students choose courses. And so there were lots of undergraduates and a pretty big master's program. And so I volunteered to help. So I had been around for a long time, familiar with the courses. So I kind of just volunteered to help at first. And then I found another student who was doing his master's at the time, and he kind of volunteered to help. And then eventually the department set up a peer advising program where people were paid some nominal amount of money to help in this process. But I mean, it sort of makes sense that many universities now have peer advising. It's like, okay, the professors have not taken the courses. Okay, they know their own courses. They know a few other courses. It's if you have well-informed students who have some perspective, they can actually provide a lot of help for the students.
Candi, could you speak a bit about your PhD research work and why did you change topics after a couple of years?
Yeah, so I started working on one topic that had to do with inventory control when you have different modes of transport that, some are faster than others. And it was I spent about over a year working on it. And then I found that it was very messy mathematically, which was fine. That didn't really bother me. But at the same time, I felt like it was a very narrow topic. And I wanted to do something that was maybe a little bit broader, a little bit newer. And so I switched to working on material requirements planning systems. And at that point in time, businesses were adopting this software to kind of manage their manufacturing, moving stuff from one place to another and so forth. And that was very popular at the time. And so what I was really interested in was how should you deal with demand uncertainty in a setting like that? And in particular, these kinds of systems were set up for, kind of targeted when you would be assembling things together. Okay, so you'd have to have some parts and they would be assembled, and then these assemblies would be put together and so forth. And so one of the things that I worked on really had to do with if you have uncertainty and you have different ways of batching things along the way, how should you go about setting inventory in the various locations in the system? So I switched to working on that. And about the same time, I ended up kind of switching advisors. My first advisor, Warren Hausman, was great. And it was actually very close to his own research. He did a lot of things on inventory and mostly stochastic problems. But he happened to have two other PhD students at the time, and maybe he was department chair. I can't really remember. But in any case, he was kind of busy. And he was very good about giving us a half hour a week, okay, every week. So you always have the half hour. But I didn't like this schedule, okay? So I really like to be able to drop in for 5 minutes, ask a question, and go back to doing my work. So I switched to working with Bob Carlson, another faculty member in the department, who was, was not bothered by my dropping in occasionally. And so that, I think that ended up working well. So I kind of had both of them as mentors, but, officially Bob Carlson was my advisor.
Right. So that transition between advisors was smooth in the end.
It was smooth because, I think that it was a very tight-knit department. The professors were they were friendly with each other. They were friends, and so I think that really helped the students a lot. And I'm not even sure that I had to go through, I'm not sure what the process was. It wasn't like I had to fill out a form to change advisors or anything like that. It was just, it just kind of happened naturally.
Mm-hmm. And even changing topics, you still got many papers out of your PhD thesis, correct?
Yeah, I worked very hard. So it was actually, okay, so I had to do a lot of computing. Fortunately, Professor Hausman had a joint appointment at the business school, and the business school had some, mini computers available. And so I and a whole bunch of PhD students at the business school, we would be running our stuff like overnight, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so that really helped a lot in getting things done. But I was able to kind of work on things in parallel. Okay, so, it wasn't like I did the work on topics sequentially, but I had different things going on at the same time. And then, I don't know. I mean, I think I just got lucky too. It did take a while to get the papers published, though. I think the last of the papers got published like 5 years after I graduated.
Yeah, but you got management science, IE transactions, and so on. So it should have been a really relevant work. So after graduating in 1981, you worked at Bell Labs for 1.5 years. What did you do there?
Well, when I was there, AT&T was in the process of it was a monopoly. It was being broken up by the Justice Department. And so I was helping AT&T figure out how to transform its retail phone business. So it used to be that you would lease your phone from the telephone company. And so they were responsible for all the repairs and so forth. But then with the breakup, that was going to be kind of spun off. So One of my projects had to do with figuring out how much inventory should be held in the so-called phone center stores. So what AT&T decided to do, they said, well, people are going to start to buy their phones now. And so we need to set up stores. So in literally hundreds and hundreds of shopping malls, they eventually set up these stores where you could go to choose your phone. So what was kind of interesting about the situation was that, they had Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck phones, and in addition to all the, your standard phones, but we needed to help set inventory levels for these things. And so it was kind of interesting to try to explain to the AT&T managers who had been accustomed to monopoly situations. So I said, okay, what kind of service level do you want? They said 100%. I'm sorry, you can't do that. And so then I said, how about 99.5? Okay, fine. So then I'd go and calculate what are the inventory levels, how many of the white telephones and black telephones and so forth, how many Mickey Mouses and so forth. And I come back, I said, okay, now you need to put 1,600 phones in that store. And they say, oh, no, this is going to be too expensive. And so this kind of taught me how to, start with basic models and then use them to help people kind of adjust parameters so that they sort of make sense. And, so rather than having a 99.5 service level, then, maybe 95 is enough, or maybe even 90 is enough. And so just helping them understand what that trade-off is. And that was a really good experience. I'd never done it before, dealing with people who were quite high in the organization, I would say. But I felt like being able to go through that process and to kind of help them to understand that trade-off and make better decisions was actually a very, very good experience at that point in my career.
Yeah. Although it was not a very long experience, it did help you when you start teaching, right?
Oh, yeah.
That practical experience.
Right, because I had war stories from day one, so, and not many people have that without, at least some full-time work experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You always intended to get an academic job, as far as I understood, but instead of going through the usual process of applying to jobs, you actually received letters from school asking for you to apply, right?
Well, I eventually did apply for jobs, but, you have to remember again, so this was around 1981, there were no personal computers yet. So no email, so to speak. Okay, no, people didn't communicate in that way. So I'm not even sure how we found out about jobs being available, because there are no websites to see where there's jobs. But what happened was that the industrial engineering department chairs collected resumes of graduating Ph.D. students. And I had just graduated 1 year before, so my advisor included it. And so this gets sent out to every industrial engineering department in the country. So I actually had people writing me letters asking me to apply. But, it was nice to get those letters because they allowed me to learn about more jobs. But it was, you think back and it seemed like a very clunky way to have to go about looking for a job. It's so much easier now.
Uh-huh. And you went to Michigan. Finally.
Yes.
Right. So you joined the University of Michigan in 1983. So you moved to Ann Arbor with your husband. And in Michigan, you conducted some interesting research motivated by the auto industry. For example, you have contributions related to the coordination of production and transportation across multiple stages in the supply chain. Could you elaborate more on this?
Yeah, so this was in the early 80s at a time when the U.S. auto industry was moving towards just in time. And so they wanted to figure out, how do we do this, given that, we produce stuff in batches, we transport stuff in batches. And so how do we, deal with these kind of fixed costs? How do we deal with the fact that we have multiple stages in our supply chain? How do we deal with the fact that a given facility would make multiple items, different items. So you can imagine, even different colors of the same thing, and then, ship it on to the next place. So how should we go about doing this? And so it was very nice because it was a time when the industry was very open to having us, new ideas and helping them to understand whether the inventory cost or the fixed cost were really dominating things, to help them figure out how to go about moving towards, a quasi just in time.
Right. I have recently worked on a car sequencing problem with a couple of very smart undergrad students, Lara Pontes and Carlos Neves. And I have noticed that you also studied this problem when you were in Michigan, right?
Yes. So when I arrived at Michigan, I was doing mostly work on dealing with uncertainty in multi-stage manufacturing systems. And I was dealing with lead time uncertainty and some other stuff. But at one point, Professor Walt Hancock, who's a senior faculty member in the IEOR Department at Michigan, took a bunch of assistant professors to one of the big three auto companies so we were told to prepare, 5 or 10 minute talks to discuss what it is we did, and everybody did that. But then afterwards, we kind of broken up into smaller meetings, and then some of the people there asked me whether, I could help them with this assembly line sequencing problem. Well, about assembly line sequencing in the auto companies, but so the problem there is that, you can't put too many cars in a row that have heavy work requirements, because then the workers get behind schedule, and that's bad for quality and all that sort of stuff. And so I knew nothing about this at all. I had never been in an auto plant, but I thought, oh, well, okay, I'll give this a go. And so I spent a lot of time walking around auto assembly plants, talking to people, trying to understand what the real situation was. And I can recall one time leaving one of the plants with, so back then we didn't have any electronic data transmission. So like literally big boxes full of printouts telling me at this station, if a person has to assemble certain kinds of things, this is how long it's going to take and all that. So then we had to read through all this stuff, because only on paper, all printed on paper. But I decided that, so I looked at the literature, but I decided that what I saw in the literature was not really accurately reflecting what was happening dynamically on the line. So there were simple rules like 3 out of 5 cars can have a sunroof or something like that, which is probably okay, but it doesn't actually, it matters whether you have 3 in a row or whether they're kind of spaced out. And so what we did in most of our work was we tried to model what would happen. So it's a moving assembly line. You've got workers following the assembly line as they are installing parts. And in our models, we have the dynamics of people moving along the assembly line, and then realizing, well, if they get too far away, then their tools no longer reach, or, they're running into the next person, and, they're going to start rushing, and that's bad for quality. So we tried to model those dynamics, and I think we were the first people to actually try to model it. And that actually led to a lot of other things later, because we were doing things differently than other people have been thinking about. Yeah.
Right. So you attempted to capture a more realistic aspect of the problem, especially involving the workers, as the assembly line was moving in practice, I would say, something like that.
Right.
You stayed at the University of Michigan for about 10 years, but the last 2 years were more like a transition to California, motivated by family reasons, correct?
Right. Yeah, my husband at some point decided that he didn't really like working in Michigan, and it was in the middle of a local recession, I would say. The auto companies were not doing well. And he also experienced a lot more discrimination than I had to deal with. I mean, Ann Arbor was, and still is, very cosmopolitan. They've got a good mix of people from different backgrounds. But I remember after we bought a Honda Civic CRX, can't remember the exact model, but this car got something like 55 miles a gallon at a time when hardly any cars would get such good gas mileage. And my husband was driving long distances, so it was important for us to have good gas mileage. The first day my husband parked his car in downtown Detroit, his tires were slashed. Okay, I mean, fortunately it's not directed at him, but it's not a good feeling. But in about the same time frame, there was one Chinese person driving on a freeway who was being shot at by somebody, so there was very strong anti-American sentiment because the U.S. car companies were having difficulty competing against the Japanese at the time. And so I think that my husband, obviously, he experienced it in a much more severe way than I did, and he sort of decided that he didn't really want to stay any longer. So he moved out to California was working for the same company, but I was still in Ann Arbor for a little bit longer. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very sad. You guys had to face this hostile environment, especially your husband. Yeah. Driving a Japanese car, and he has Japanese origins, and being somewhat attacked. Of course, it was the car, right?
Yes, right.
But still, it's very, very disappointing. So you first went to Berkeley, then Stanford, then Berkeley. So how was it?
Yeah. So there my husband is in California. I'm trying to figure out how to deal with this long distance marriage at a time when there were no cell phones, right? So you had to be near a landline. We were both working long hours, and the only time we could talk was on weekends. So this was not a good situation. I was very fortunate. I applied for a National Science Foundation grant through a program that was designed to get the few women faculty in engineering kind of circulating around the country. Okay, so giving them opportunities to go to other universities, just so I think that there would be more women around. So I spent 1 year at Berkeley under that program. And it was a nice opportunity to, I wanted to learn a little bit more about semiconductor industry, and obviously can't do that in Michigan so well. So that was good. And so I spent a year doing that. And Berkeley was in the process of making me an offer, but I wasn't sure that I was ready to take it. And so it was nice. Stanford made me an offer for teaching 1 year there, so I did that. And it was kind of nice because, Stanford being my alma mater, and, I was still not that far out of school. And so, my professors were there and so forth. It kind of felt like a very supportive environment, right? To kind of think about whether I wanted to take the Berkeley offer. And so eventually I did take the Berkeley offer, but, this is why the back and forth.
Yeah. So you went to Berkeley for a while, then Stanford. You had a bit of nostalgia there. And then you accepted the offer from Berkeley. Excellent. So then you kept, of course, doing research work, and you have done some work on the interface between operations and marketing. I would like to hear more about some of your contributions on such interface.
Okay. I'll pick one, something that most people can relate to. It's now popular for retailers to introduce private labels or store brands. They tend to be cheaper. Sometimes the quality is a little bit lower than the national brand, but most people find them quite acceptable. And so there's been a lot of work in the marketing literature on whether a retailer should introduce a store brand and all this, but the marketing people don't often think about who is actually producing this. And if you look at it in kind of the game theoretic context, then who produces it actually does matter a lot, because in some cases it turns out that big national brand manufacturers, they will produce your private label for you if you ask them to. Sometimes retailers, very big retailers, have their own factories, okay, so they could do it themselves, or they could ask a third party, another company, to make this thing for them. So, one of the things that some co-authors and I, former doctoral student Bo Yao and various other people, we've worked on questions of, if you take all of this into account, how does this change the way you should make decisions? Does it affect whether or not you should introduce this store brand? Does it affect the pricing and all that sort of stuff? And so it ends up being very, very complicated. Math, where the appendices are as long as the main text of the paper, but it's very interesting, and you get a lot of results that are sometimes counter to what prior researchers have claimed.
Yeah, I can understand that it can be difficult because you're working with different disciplines and understanding some aspects of both ends and trying to synchronize them. And also when you talk about pricing and even studying all of that from a game theoretical point of view, it's really complicated yet fascinating, I would say.
Yeah, I can recall one time when Bo came to my office, and she's actually an amazing student, but she came into my office and said, well, I'm really sorry that I couldn't finish what I said I would do, but I discovered that there's 320 different cases I have to consider, and I've only been able to finish 160 of them this week. So anyway, that's kind of, the nature of the complication.
Wow. And what about your work involving the well-known publisher JSTOR and librarians? Yeah,
so about 10 years or maybe 12 years ago or so,
Roger Schoenfeld,
who was at the research arm of JSTOR, somehow contacted me. I'm not sure, he probably called me up and asked for help because he said that, so JSTOR provides electronic access to 200 or more journals, going way back from, the beginning of publication. And so he said, well, we have one copy of all the journals sitting at Harvard and another at UCLA. I'm not sure who owns them, but anyway, they were sort of put aside for, protection, let's just say. But he asked me, is this enough? And, it's an interesting question, right? Because they would like to be able to rescan the material as time goes on. If you use JSTOR, and occasionally you'll run into some material that you can see the scans are not very good because it was done 20 years ago, and they're huge files because the technology didn't really allow things to be compressed, so they would like to rescan periodically. And so I started to ask around. Again, I'd never done anything like this before. And so I just took the time to talk to people. I started with people in the chemistry department, asking them about paper and stuff like that. And anyway, eventually I was talking to insurance companies about, when do these things get lost? How do they get damaged? So eventually some co-authors and I was kind of the lead on it, but I brought other people into it to figure out, can we build a simple model that would help them to understand what they should do? So what JSTOR had done was, for all of this huge collection, they'd gone through page by page, literally page by page, tried to fix things as best they could on every page, okay? So, obviously you can't do that for a third set. It's just too expensive. So we had to be creative and think about, well, what are the options here? So we knew that for many of the journals, there's stuff sitting on university libraries all over the place. And if they could just get universities to agree not to throw it away, then they could use it as kind of a virtual backup. Okay, so you say, okay, we've got these 2 copies. Something happens to one of these now cleaned up copies, I lose one volume. I go ask, UC Berkeley or Ohio State or, your favorite university, would you please sell us, this one volume, and, we'll clean that up and then put it away in storage. And so this is kind of the model that we put together with, all the underlying probabilities and all the data that we got from various places. And so we just built a very simple model to help them figure out, under this kind of mode, what should you do? How many backup copies would you need to have, And so that was a lot of fun. It took a long time because I knew nothing about library books and the like and storage. Yeah. And then more recently, about 4 years ago now, a different group, so headed by Ian Bogus, who is the executive director of a consortium called RECAP. So it includes Princeton and University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard is involved too. Oh, and the New York Public Library. Okay, so they started to ask, okay, so there's an organization of librarians that, okay, I'm not a member of, but he is a member of. And they have tried to organize these kind of working groups of people to study these questions. Okay, so just a set of folks, most of them are circulation managers at major universities. One is from the National Library of Congress. And so again, okay, so they wanted me to help them figure out a model for books, just regular books. And the distinction here was that the books could be stored in, say, off-site storage, more secure, more environmentally controlled. And so, the risk of loss, physical loss, and the risk of deterioration would be lower there. Or you could just have it on a regular library shelf, right? So those are the main kinds of conditions. And given that you have those two options, how many do you need, or could you have 3 in, offsite storage and, 6 over, on library shelves, and would that work? And so the main idea here is to kind of inform consortia of university or research libraries on what they should do, given, the age of the book. And so, yes, I forgot to mention the fact that if you put the books in better environmentally controlled conditions, the paper deteriorates at a slower rate, and so we were concerned about what people, I consider kind of usability. Can you actually use this book? Can you turn the pages and all that? So I'm sorry, I'm rambling here a little bit. But anyway, yeah, so it's a lot of fun. We're working with these people. We've kind of put together a nice model. They and others have collected data, so we're able to use actual data that have gotten from people checking, are these books actually on the shelf and how are they deteriorating and stuff like this. And so that was recently published. So, it's kind of nice, and probably one of the few OR people who's actually published in a library-related journal.
Yeah. So did they finally adopt the solution you proposed?
Well, you see, it requires consortia of libraries to buy into this, okay? But I think what's good is that the whole library community is realizing that they need more quantitative tools. And so, they're now realizing, well, if they have fewer copies of a book, across, a set of universities than what we've suggested, then they need to think about putting more of them in more secure and better environmentally controlled conditions, so that they'll be around for much longer. Right. So I feel like, this is one of these things where you do something to help people make better decisions. You can't tell them how to make the decisions, but you can at least help them to be closer to what it is they would like to target.
Yeah, I can see that you became very excited.
Yeah, it's great fun. It's in the end, if you look at the model is not that hard from a technical standpoint, but it took a long time to get there because you have to really understand what's going on, figure out what you're going to model, how you're going to model it, and actually enjoy working on projects like this. I learn a lot about things I didn't know about, and I feel like, especially this particular project and the one with JSTOR, what can I contribute to humankind going forward? And I feel like, having research material available for future generations is very important. Okay, I feel strongly about that. And so this has allowed me to contribute to that.
Yeah, there's no question about the relevance of that work. Candi, you have supervised more than 20 PhD students. I'm sure they learn a lot from you, but what did you learn from them?
So all of my students have been very different from one another. And I think what I've learned most from them is that different people think about problems in different ways. Okay, they come at the problems from different perspectives. And so I spend a lot of time in a collaborative relationship with my students, meet with them regularly, do a lot of brainstorming and the like. And so I feel like, that collaborative process has been really informative. And I've kind of learned over the years that every student needs kind of different kinds of coaching. I mean, I've had some students in the past where I'd meet with them and then maybe again 2 weeks later, and, they're very independent. We sort of go in this sort of 2-week cycle and we'd say, okay, this is what you're going to do over the next couple of weeks. And they'd come back and we'd meet for 20 minutes or so, and that was it. There have been other students who wanted to meet much more often. I've occasionally had a student who, especially during the summer when, classes are not in session, they come into my office multiple times a day. Okay. And so that's like the other end of the spectrum, but they're all different, and how you interact with them is different just because, of how they work and, the nature of the collaborative process. So, I mean, I feel that, with my co-authors too, it's sort of the same thing, just everybody's different. You figure out how to work with each other and figure out how to communicate with each other. Yeah.
Yeah. You were one of the co-founders of WORMS. Would you share the story behind its creation?
Yeah, so I can't remember the exact year, but it must have been around 1990. It may have been even a little bit before that a handful of female faculty started to get together for lunch. And then along the way, one of my former doctoral students, Carla Borland, who eventually became a professor and then went into industry after that, we decided to meet for lunch at the Informs, well, not Informs at the time, Orsa Tim's meetings. And so some of the people I remember, now it's a long time ago, I can't remember everybody, but Janny Leung was definitely involved, Margaret Brando, whom I knew because of the Stanford connection, Judith Liebman, Donna Llewellyn, and there were several others, but I can recall, it was not a big group in the beginning. I think 6 or 8 of us would meet for lunch. And, there were lots of things being discussed that were particular to women academics, okay? And so we eventually decided that we should form an organization within Orsa or TIMS. But the problem was that all of the other groups were technical groups. And so it took us a little while to convince the powers that be that even though we were not a technical group, that we should be able to have some sessions or something like that. And so we eventually formed WORMS at the time of the Orsa TIMS merger. And so that was 1995. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the beginning, it was not that big, but I think that it ended up being a very useful support system for women faculty because there weren't that many, and many were relatively young. So, they're dealing with things like, raising kids, raising small kids. Some universities didn't have any family leave for childbirth. And so, being able to share information was really helpful. And so, like somebody would come to one of these meetings and discover, actually there's a lot of universities that have something resembling maternity leave. So, I can maybe go back to my university. And so I think that I can't say that it was instrumental in making change, because I'm sure that, change was taking place anyway, but it really did help, at least within our community, for women professionals in the field to, get a little bit more support than what they were getting at the time.
Mm-hmm. And Informs recognized all your efforts in that sense and gave you a prize for that, right? So
yes, right. Yeah, so that was from Worms, yeah. But a lot of other women have received that award as well. Many women have been contributing.
Sure. You mentioned Jenny and Margaret. I had the chance to meet the three of you in Santiago very recently. I'm so happy. Yeah. So Jeanette's song also, I had the chance to meet her, so it was very nice. Candi, tell me about your involvement on the creation of the Manufacturing and Service Operations Management Society and its associated journal.
Oh, okay. So I happen to be president of the ORSA Special Interest Group on Manufacturing Management, right before the ORSA-TIMSS merger. And I had served as co-organizer of that organization's conference, I think the previous year, along with John Buzzacott. He was the co-chair. And so the situation was that the TIMSS section, that kind of parallel TIMSS section, was kind of defunct. Nothing was happening, no activity. And so I was in the position of trying to put together a merger with a kind of non-active organization. So that was kind of how I ended up being involved in organizing MSOM. That was the merger of these two units. And the fact that I had been involved in organizing the prior year's conference kind of set in motion a possibility for, that was 1994. 1996, we actually had the first MSOM conference. So this, what I did was kind of a predecessor to MSOM, but you can think of it as, the first in this series of conferences that took place. Yeah. And then I was also, because of my position there, I ended up being on a committee to help choose the first editor of the MSOM journal, and I ended up serving on the editorial board for a while. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you expect the society and the journal to grow like it grew?
Sometimes you can't tell, right? But, there's just a lot going on. And so I think, now the membership is huge. And Worms has grown a lot too. And so, it's kind of nice to be there at the origins of these things. And, they all take on a life of their own. And I think it's great, so younger generations of people continue to push on the cause. Yeah.
Uh-huh. You acted as editor-in-chief of IIE Transactions. Is there anything you would like to share regarding this activity?
I was editor-in-chief of IIE Transactions, and in that role, that's more of an administrative role, but for many, many years before that, I was on the editorial board in capacities where I would actually interact with the authors. And one of the things I tried to do was to try to help the authors. So there were times when, there were young authors not really quite knowing how they ought to write papers, or kind of making assumptions that didn't make sense, or not really explaining things very well. And so I would take the time often to help the authors to, if I thought that the paper had promise, I would sort of go beyond the usual to try to help authors along. And, I got a sense of satisfaction out of that, being able to contribute to research in kind of a non-traditional way there. So I can say that being involved in editorial work for journals is very rewarding. It's a lot of work most of the time, but it keeps you abreast of the research that's going on because, in our field, if a paper, from the time it's first written until the time it's published, 2 or 3 years. And so what you're reading is now kind of old. Okay. So if you can see it when, people are first writing the papers, it's a good experience. And I think that as you read the papers and comment on them, you learn yourself how to do that better as well. And so I think that even though, most of the time you're giving advice, I think that, it kind of keeps the wheels going and it kind of affects how you do your own research.
Uh-huh. So talking about administrative roles, you served 6 years as department chair and 3 years as associate dean at the Berkeley Business School. As department chair, you were the first woman and you were the first Asian American to occupy the role of dean at the Berkeley Business School. What can you share from these experiences, and do you miss being in this type of leadership positions?
Yeah, so I was the first female department chair in engineering. And to be honest, I was kind of surprised because what year was this? 1995. And, a lot of peer schools had certainly had female department chairs by then. But I don't know that being a woman was such an issue at the time. But, I think what was interesting for me was the fact that at the time, there had just been a lot of retirements in IEOR. So it was kind of a time where there was opportunity for change. And so I spent a lot of energy trying to lobby with the dean to get some minimal resources to make the whole work environment better for people. And so we were able to get some resources to move most of the Ph.D. students to an area where they still didn't have windows, but they were much closer to the faculty. We didn't have very much workable space. And so we also were able to create a small classroom for the department to use and a conference room and so forth. And so that felt good because you can kind of, you actually see it and you can see how it affects people's working lives. And then at Haas, I was associate dean at the time of very heavy faculty hiring. Now, again, being Asian American, I don't know that it had that much of an effect. I mean, I can't really tell, right? There had been at least one female associate dean prior. But I think, I really enjoyed being able to work with the various groups within the school to help them hire new faculty. That's a lot of fun, and getting to know the new faculty as they come in and support them in the process of, getting their research off the ground. And so, this is what really gave me a lot of satisfaction. And, another thing I did was to lobby with the dean to give more money to the PhD students because the cost of living had gone up quite a lot. And so it was a little difficult for them to, pay for their expenses. And so I was able to make a little bit of progress on that. So I think that's one of the, so again, what I was trying to do was, to kind of help these people along, the new assistant professors and the PhD students.
And there's the second question, if you missed.
Oh, yes. Well, okay. So being associate dean at Haas is, it consumes essentially your whole life. Okay, so I used to joke with people. I said, I have a break. Once every 3 weeks, I get to make a trip to Costco. Costco is one of these big warehouse stores, so you can buy in large quantities to last you for 3 weeks. So, but I spend essentially all my time working. Now, after I stepped down, they actually split the job. So there's 2 people doing what I previously did. And so maybe it's better for those people now. But no, I have an interesting job it's much smaller in scope, but a lot of fun. So I'm faculty director for a joint program between an MBA and Master of Engineering. So the students come in, they spend 2 years and they get 2 degrees. And so I do pre-admissions advising. I help to supervise their capstone project, help them figure out how to manage the 2 different enrollment systems. Okay, so for engineering and business and stuff. But it's a lot of fun to work with them because these students they're technical. They've got undergraduate technical degrees, but they're also interested in business. And so, kind of seeing them merge or those 2 things and to work on projects that really span those 2 fields, really, it's a lot of fun. Great deal of fun. And it's not as much work as being associate dean.
Yeah, you have certainly influenced a lot of people in different contexts. I'm really impressed, not only about influencing students, transmitting knowledge, but also to the point of increasing their scholarship or their grants and finding more room. So you have been fighting for development in every aspect of the profession, from starting forums, societies, journals, and occupying important leadership positions at your school. So it's just remarkable, Candi. And I mean, it's safe to say that you have been a pioneer of several initiatives that require creativity, vision, resilience, and so on. I see that many young students and faculty feel somewhat discouraged to think out of the box and even to take some risks in their endeavors, possibly because of the way things turn out to be in academia. What are your thoughts on this matter? And please feel free to give any type of advice to these folks.
So I really have to thank quite a number of people in my life because they allowed me to do things differently sometimes. Okay, so my parents for supporting me in my long educational endeavor, even though I think that beyond about 11th grade, they didn't really know what I was doing. Various teachers along the way for letting me do things sometimes differently or doing things sort of outside the norm. Orsa, Tim's, and Inform's leaders for giving me an opportunity to do things even when I was quite young and inexperienced. Journal editors who brought me in. And so I went back and checked my resume. So there were people who actually appointed me as associate editor when I was like a 3-year assistant professor. It's like, oh, I don't know that most people would take such risk, but they took the risk on me. My Ph.D. students were kind of pulling me into topics that I had never thought I would work on. So I'd always encourage my students to, find something that they were interested in, and I would supervise them if it kind of fit what I felt that I could do. But many of them have pulled me into things that I didn't think were very new, and I'm very glad. And let's see, who else? My husband, who would just let me work when I needed to work, kind of supported me in the process, sometimes moving around the country to support my career, So I feel like I was very supported in the process of doing things that most of the stuff I've done, I would not say completely outside the box, okay? But more that I saw a need and I would go about trying to convince other people politely that it made sense to, try these new things, okay? And so, I don't know, I think I've been that way my whole life, ever since I was a kid. And I'm very happy that, I'm sure that there were some people who tried to stop me, but, that most of the people were very supportive in allowing me to kind of push forward these initiatives. So, the only thing I had to do was just notice that something could be changed. And so that's why I think, don't be discouraged. You can try, and sometimes things don't work, but even little things can make a big difference to people. So there's no need, and you don't need to have big ideas. Sometimes the ideas are very simple. And all you need to do is just, try to start moving things along. So I happen to be, just one example, I was chair of the so-called job placement committee in Informs way back before internet. So I suggested that we have something resembling the career fair. And of course, it took some staff time, took some money, but Informs went along with the idea. And so this is not a very novel idea. Other organizations were doing it, but just to, take a little bit of time and effort to get the resources and get the buy-in to move things along. It's a lot of fun. And then, you see these things kind of grow up on their own. They take on a life of their own. And it feels good, right? You feel like you've made it ends up being a much broader contribution than, you originally ever imagined.
Yes. I mean, as I said already, you have made tremendous impact in our community overall. And you certainly have helped change the lives of many people in a positive way. I mean, I wish I had the chance to work with you at some point because you look so inspiring. And
hey, we can do some assembly line balancing stuff.
That would be fantastic. Yeah. I mean, Candi, I don't know how to thank you. It has been great to talk to you. I love to learn about your stories, your life, and now I can see why you got very important awards for all your efforts. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. You are really an exceptional interviewer, and I'm really glad to be able to share some of my stories with people. I hope that, provide some inspiration, and I hope they see that even if they've gone through some challenges, that they can overcome them and move on to the next phase of their lives.
Yeah, exactly. Especially the youngsters.
Yes.
It's important for them to learn what people like you did in the past and the opportunities they have now. Some of them are thanks to efforts made by people like you, and it's very important that they are aware of that so they can be inspired and do the same for the next generations.
Okay.
So, and you've done that, and you're doing such a good work for our community. So, I mean, we just have to thank you very, very much for.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to share.
Yeah. Okay, Candi, you've been to South America recently, Santiago, but if you want to consider Brazil in your plans, do not hesitate to send me a message. And
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay. Take care of your health, and see you soon, Candi.
You too. Take care. Take care. Bye. Bye.